video is about red blood cells in particular, and I kind of paused on the last video, and it kind of sounded like I was leaving you hanging about blood cell production, but it's just because I wanted to kind of double check about how much we wanted to go into detail about this, because when we go into detail about the types of red blood, or the type of blood cells, we'll go into more detail about their production. So this is just going over that the bone marrow is producing all 7 types of cells, and they all start from what's called pluripotent stem cells. So these are cells that, stem cells mean a type of cell that has kind of not developed into its certain type yet, and so these are formed in the bone marrow, and then from there they get into little groups called colony-forming units. And that means that they're specialized stem cells that are eventually going to become one type of blood cell. So all the red blood cells, all the stem cells that are going to become red blood cells would go into these colony-forming units. And then there are still lymphocytes that are formed in the lymphatic organs, so the spleen, the thymus, lymph nodes. So we will get into more detail about this as we look at each type of blood cell. So this lecture is focusing on erythrocytes, red blood cells. We're going to look at their structure, function, specifically about hemoglobin, that's very important, and look at their life cycle, and then also some problems that can happen to red blood cells. So this is looking at kind of a cross-section view of red blood cells in a capillary. So you can see that little weird-looking shape that they're kind of sliced in half in that picture. Their main function is to carry oxygen from the lungs to all of the cell tissues, and then carry carbon dioxide from the tissues back to the lungs. The red blood cell's job is extremely important. We can result in death within minutes due to lack of oxygen in our tissues. So there's the red blood cell up close. They're very tiny, only 7.5 micrometers in diameter and 2 thick. They lose nearly all of their organelles during development. So when you look at it, it's not going to look like a normal cell. You won't see a nucleus, you won't see any mitochondria, but we will talk about what is included on that cell and how that works towards its function. When we get to blood types, we will see that there are proteins and lipids on the surface of each red blood cell that determines the type, which will determine the blood type of an individual. And we'll also know that the proteins, cytoskeletal proteins, give that cell membrane some durability and resilience. It does have to kind of be resilient as far as stretching and squeezing when it travels through very small capillaries. Gas transport is the major function, and so that helps us understand why a red blood cell needs to have an increased surface area to volume ratio. Back in A&P1, you talked about that when the surface area is not large enough, then the cell struggles to be efficient in moving things across the membrane. And red blood cells are no different. So they do need to have a large surface area. It increases the diffusion rates of substances. And then 33% of the cytoplasm is hemoglobin, which is a protein, which is extremely important in allowing the red blood cells to function the way they do in that oxygen delivery and the carbon dioxide transport. 280 million hemoglobin molecules on one red blood cell, which is amazing to me. Looking up close at the hemoglobin, each hemoglobin molecule has 4 protein chains and 4 hemigroups. So those groups are what allows the binding of the oxygen. So for each one hemoglobin molecule, each group can bind 1 molecule of oxygen. So each hemoglobin is able to carry 4 oxygen molecules at once. And then the protein chains are important in carrying the carbon dioxide. Now this talks about, your book talks about more detail about the difference between adult hemoglobin and fetal hemoglobin in the types of protein chains, but you can read about that, but we're not going to spend too much time on it. Okay, we would expect if we have a higher red blood cell count that there will be a higher hemoglobin concentration, and then of course that indicates how much oxygen the blood can carry. So looking at the number of red blood cells, directly correlates to the amount of hemoglobin we would expect in the blood, and then that in turn times 4 would be the amount of oxygen that the red blood cells are able to carry. This does vary from men to women. Men have higher red blood cell count and therefore a higher hemoglobin concentration. Some reasons for this: the androgens in men are stimulating red blood cell production. We women also have some blood loss during our menstrual time. And also the hematocrit, or the amount of blood cells, is inversely proportional to percentage of body fat. So as body fat increases, then the formed elements in the hematocrit would be decreasing. Okay, here looks at a close-up of just a red blood cell lifespan or production. And so again, it starts from that pluripotent stem cell. Then all of the blood cells, or the stem cells that are going to become erythrocytes, can clump up into these colony-forming units. And then it goes through precursor cells, and then finally the mature red blood cell called the erythrocyte. 2.5 million are produced every second, and each red blood cell has an average lifespan of about 120 days. That development process that you see in that image takes about 3 to 5 days. Okay, that image back there, I would definitely take a look at it in your book, but I'm going to talk about it first. So we know that iron is a key nutritional requirement, but we're going to look at exactly why. We lose it daily through urine and feces and bleeding. And if we have a low absorption rate of iron, then we would need to consume about 5 to 20 milligrams per day to replace all of that. So this talks about the different types of iron. There's 2 different types. Iron's a transition metal, so it makes 2 ions. The kind in our diet would be iron 3 and iron 4, or iron 3 and 2, excuse me, ferric and ferrous. And so our stomach acid converts that into, if it's ferric, it converts it into ferrous, which is more absorbed ability, or it has the ability to be absorbed by our small intestines. It's absorbed into the blood and then transported into the bone marrow, and this is required for hemoglobin to be able to be produced. Okay, so let's talk about how the negative feedback control works for red blood cells. We know that negative feedback control just means if there's a drop in something or we're lacking something, kind of that messenger system to how the body is going to increase production. So a drop in red blood cell count, it will be noticed in the kidneys. Hypoxemia is just a low red blood cell count and low oxygen levels. And so those low oxygen levels in the kidney is what's going to trigger the production of red blood cells. And so the kidney produces protein, and that stimulates the bone marrow to increase their red blood cell count, or red blood cell production. But it increases, it's not overnight, it takes 3 to 4 days for those red blood cells. We just said 3 to 5 days for them to mature. So it does take a few days for this all to get back into balance. There's some other reasons that we may have a low oxygen level, high altitude, or an increase of exercise, or possibly a loss of lung tissue when there's emphysema involved. And so those 3 could potentially just trigger more red blood cell production based on low oxygen. Okay, so once that 120-day life of a red blood cell is up, it lyses, which means it bursts in the narrow channels in the spleen. And there's macrophages in the spleen to help digest those parts that have burst. The heme group is separated from the globin of the hemoglobin, and so the globins are broken down into amino acids, and the iron is removed from the heme, and then kind of goes glucose talks about where everything is going. The iron is released into the blood plasma, and then the liver removes other proteins and secretes into bile. So everything kind of gets broken down. Everything goes into different locations to be reused. And that's just talking about the same thing, just in kind of a picture format. And again, I would encourage you to watch through these animations. You need to be in presentation mode to see them. Some disorders for red blood cells. An excess of red blood cells, polycythemia, and you could have cancer of those cells were the ones not a full mature cell, but the erythropoietic cell is the cell that was maturing into the erythrocyte. So you could potentially have a cancer of those cells that would be in the red blood or in the bone marrow. This could lead to increased blood volume, which would then, of course, lead to increased blood pressure, could lead to an embolism or stroke or heart failure. Anemia is probably the most common red blood cell disorder. It falls into 3 categories. So inadequate erythropoiesis or hemoglobin synthesis. So that means not making red blood cells or making hemoglobin to the sufficient amount. Or you could have a hemorrhagic anemia from too much bleeding, or hemolytic anemia from the red blood cell destruction. Those anemias could have potential consequences. They could lead to tissue hypoxia. So if that happens, the patient, you would expect to be lethargic. They might have a shortness of breath, and it could be life-threatening if we're talking about this necrosis occurring in the brain, the heart, or the kidney. The other consequence is that blood osmolarity is reduced, and that would produce tissue edema. Remember, that's an excess tissue fluid. And it also can reduce the blood viscosity. So we want the blood to be viscous to be able to travel everywhere it needs to go, but low viscosity could be a potential consequence, and that could lead to cardiac failure. Another red blood cell disorder is called sickle cell disease. It is heredity, and it's when the hemoglobin is defective. It is more common in African American populations or people from African descent. It is caused by a recessive allele, and it makes the hemoglobin molecule have a deformed structure. So that's based on a mutation in the amino acids. And so this type, which is called HbS instead of HbA, it doesn't bind to oxygen well. So those cells are unable to carry oxygen like other red blood cells. And then their shape also doesn't allow them to move through those vessels and capillaries very well. So they tend to clump, which can be a problem.